Welcome to the next session of Building Research Relevance. My name is Stephen Shaw. I'm the interim chair of the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology. I will have to stop saying that soon as the new chair is taking over in a few weeks. But that's where we are today. I am a school psychologist, and one of the most important things I do is train the next generation. So as we talk about building research relevance, I want to talk a little bit about how we can train the next generation to create relevant research, not what we have right now. And there's a lot of evidence. One of the really good papers recently is written by Chelsea Moran and colleagues who really just surveyed students throughout Canada to talk about what the next generation thinks about open science. And most of the constructs we've talked about, whether it's open science issues or other issues related to building research relevance, are pretty well regarded. However, the issue is that the supervisors they have, the instructors they have, don't really value the open science. And this is one of the big things. Either don't know about it or they haven't really done this. They don't want to change. Many young people are thinking that, gee, they just won't, my supervisor won't let us engage in some of these practices. Excuse me. And so this happens quite a bit. In fact, in my role as department chair over the last couple of years, I've seen people come to me, report that their supervisor, typically a tenured professor, engages in some pretty sketchy stuff when it comes to data collection. And it's really hard to decide whether there needs to be an investigation, a report to the granting agency, a report to the university, or whether this is really just the kind of business as usual of the opaque types of investigations that we used to call science instead of open science. In other words, where is it fitting in there? But really what we're seeing now is a lot of students really see that the way their supervisor does things is kind of sketchy. And as I've talked to experienced academics, talking about some of the aspects of open science, or talking about how they can make their research more relevant and useful, I get a lot of really strange excuses. These folks don't want to change. One of the most common ones is I want to receive high merit because we have a merit evaluation system at our university. And that really depends on publishing a lot of papers. Also, grants. You get grants because you publish a lot of papers. Grants are becoming more important than publications when it comes to... Excuse me, I still haven't shaken my cough. When it comes to publications, they're so important, but you have to produce a lot. And any change of the mechanism of how they do their publication pipeline threatens their careers. They threaten their ideas. We also have people to say, I need my model that my theory, my pet project to be confirmed. Because if I do the research that will reject that, then I don't have a career, which strikes me as bizarre and certainly anti-science. Or people will say, I've mastered these methods and invested a lot of time and energy into that. I really don't have the time and energy to learn a new approach. Again, stagnant thinking, selfish thinking. I shouldn't say selfish, it's just we have incentives that support that. And so my own view is when you speak to students about this, about building research relevance, it makes sense. It takes about things like open science practices, which is just part of that credibility building. Students really like it. Their supervisors do not. And I get it. It's tough. We have incentive structures. There's a really good blog, and I can't remember who wrote it, talking about we can't have any research reform unless we have incentive reform at the universities. This is true. But it goes back to the Max Planck thing of science advances one funeral at a time. Is that Max Planck? I think so. Could have been Niels Bohr. I'm going with, I think it's Max, that science advances one funeral at a time. What he really said is a new scientific truth doesn't triumph by convincing components and making them see the light, but because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that's familiar with the new ideas. But to do this, you actually have to train the new researchers. And if we're going to talk about how we can build research relevance, how we can make research a more relevant tool to use when we're talking about policy making or clinical practice or whatever it is, or theory building, the way we all think about things. If we're going to do this, almost all of building research relevance is about training new researchers and new clinicians to develop and use relevant research. I say almost entirely about training because we do need people in power to build the infrastructure for research relevance to take place. Journal and review reform, consortia development as a norm, training reform of what courses and the curriculum they get, and many of the other things we've discussed throughout this session of building research relevance. So training is the big part. But how are we going to do this? Though Chelsea Moran's paper is really, really good, it's about general ideas in all across research in psychology. So it's the experimental psych and developmental psych. Excuse me. Man, I shouldn't record if I'm going to cough, but I'm doing it anyway. But these are different than the clinical psychology. Clinical school counseling psychology. In those courses, there's a requirement that they have research methods courses. And the way we teach it requires significant reform. And this is actually something I will be working on over the next several years. But right now we have infinite variations of ANOVA and regression. They've had this since their second year of university, where they have to take stats to be a psychology major. Even if they're not psychology majors, they were linguistics majors or sociology majors, they're still pretty much the same stats course. It's ANOVA and regression. They get it as an undergraduate. They get it again in graduate school. We call that methods, and that's fine. But in fact, they're just learning these techniques. And we call it research methods. So they've received some solutions. They've learned how to use a couple of tools, not all the tools. And they don't even know why they're doing the tools. That's like becoming a master with a hammer or a chainsaw and not knowing why you're using the hammer or the chainsaw. So I'm not really a fan of throwing the whole null hypothesis significant testing away. And I'm not one of those people who believe somehow that qualitative methods are magically an answer. To me, it just creates a whole new set of problems that require the same issue. But we do need to rethink that just teaching these very, very simple, basic forms of tools that we use to answer some questions are the same as teaching students how to research. One of the most important things we could do is we could start with a basic epistemology or philosophy of science course. I would much rather have that replace some of the very basic univariate types of statistics that people learn early. They could learn research design and modeling and focus entirely on how to ask the right question based on theory or a model or something of that nature. Right now, they know how to answer questions. They don't know how to ask questions. And this creates an irrelevant science that simply sits off there, and we just, worship at the altar of 0.05, which is fairly arbitrary. Nothing wrong with that. A good arbitrary ruling. People watching this are going to worry about me. Okay. But what we really need to do is to create these ideas where it's a deeper idea of what research is, how we know things, how it's going to be used, how it can come from models and theories. Once we have that, research can become relevant. But we have to teach people how to do it. We can't just give them a couple of tools, say just go apply those tools. We have a lot of people who think right now, unless you are doing a null hypothesis significance testing type of approach, using some of the very basic techniques. Most students don't even know nonparametrics. They don't know Bayesian techniques. They don't know any of these things. So the idea is when you only have those tools, everything looks like it should be answered with those tools. When you have a nail, when you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But we haven't taught them what they're trying to accomplish with this hammer and nails. If you're supposed to build a house and you have an architect that draws plans and you have materials engineering put in place, then you know how to use your hammer, why you're using it, how it can be evolved. Or maybe the hammer's not the best technique. Maybe there's another one out there. But we need to give them that bigger picture, step back and become architects, not nail pounders. And that's kind of what we've done right now. So research design, modeling, focus entirely on how to ask a question, as well as the background of basic epistemology, basic philosophy of science is a great place to start in a reform of training. The other thing we really need to focus on heavily is because we use the word all the time in clinical training, where we talk about evidence-based practice as a key. And that we have a scientist practitioner model. I mean, this is since the Boulder model way back in the 1950s. No, 1940s. 1940s, I think. No, I'm stuck. I think it's 1950s. But the Boulder model talked about a scientist practitioner approach. We just kind of magically assume that if they know how to do statistics and if they have to do a doctoral thesis, that suddenly their research will be a scientist practitioner focus that heavily emphasizes evidence-based practices. I don't know, that seems wishful thinking. That's like the underpants gnome from South Park. I don't know how you plan on getting to a scientist practitioner approach using evidence-based practices when we just teach these things. We really need to focus on how research can be relevant. Once we have relevant research, research to practice becomes closer. It becomes reciprocally helpful in informing one another on this. To do any of this, we really need to reform incentives for academics, not simply to publish as many PHAC papers as possible or just crank out widgets. We really need to focus the incentives on who's changing a field and how they're building capacity. Yeah, I know these are harder to measure, but we can't do things, we do things, and the sole reason we do them is because they're easy to measure. Are they effective? No. Do they measure the construct we want? No. But they're easy to do. That's not a good argument. Researchers should kind of know this. Why don't we figure out how to ask the right question on how to assign academic incentives? Why don't we have some good research design and good modeling? And then we can figure out how to do incentives. And once we do that, we can go through it. Right now, all we know is student evaluation of teaching and number of publications and what the impact factor is of the journals. And some people don't even use the impact factor. So we really have to reform incentives. But ultimately, if we're going to make a difference, if we're going to build relevant research, we need to build the capacity. And to start, we have to do that through reforming training. And that doesn't require all or even the majority of current experienced researchers to be engaged in this reform of research. But it requires some. Let's build the capacity because the kids are all right. They will take this and go with it. We have to give them permission. We have to have the capacity. We have to give them the incentives, and they will do it. I have a lot of faith in our next generation, but let's not stand in their way because that's what we're doing right now. So that's one of the ways we can build research relevance through training students and giving them opportunities and infrastructure to make this happen. Thanks very much, and I'll see you the next time.